Good evening. Tonight we're going to be going over a Medici porcelain Pilgrim flask by Claire Le Corbusier. Claire Le Corbusier was born in 1931 and passed away at the age of 71 in 2003 after a 5-year battle with cancer. She was the curator of the decorative arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her areas of specialty included continental porcelain, metalwork, jewelry with an emphasis in 18th century French, as well as Chinese export porcelain. According to her New York Times obituary, she was a quote, old school curator, which meant someone who was trained through mostly direct contact with objects. She did, however, attend lectures on art history by Seymour Slive and Wolfgang Stetchow. And she attended these lectures during her time at the Rhode Island School of Design, RISD, for advertising. She published many books and articles on the topics of these historical objects. And in fact, MoMA published a collection of her essays in either 2002 or posthumously in 2003. An interesting part of Claire's life was that she was actually raised around museums. Her mother, in fact, worked for a museum as well, which I think helped her with her old school curation education. The main statement of the article was that this is in fact a Medici flask. It was written for the J. Paul Getty Museum Journal in 1988 for volume 6, which makes sense since this Pilgrim flask is part of the Getty Museum's collection. She went into the history of the Medici porcelain Pilgrim flask, the stylistic character of the flask, as well as the Chinese and Ottoman influences. Right here is a picture of the Getty Museum, where somewhere in here is hiding that flask that we're about to go into. Ms. Le Corbusier used a lot of primary sources for this article. She used ledgers for transactions. She went into journal entries and notes that people made that tracked the provenance of the piece. She also used examples of other porcelain wares that were either from the Medici collection or from the Ottoman Empire that helped to show the artistic influence of the piece. It was a very interesting exploration of just how useful primary sources can be when trying to track the lineage of a historic artifact. There were a few terms that I was either unfamiliar with or perhaps we had gone over a couple times during the semester, but I still needed to double check to make sure I knew what we were talking about. One word was pilgrim flask. What exactly is a pilgrim flask? Well, a pilgrim flask is a flat-sided vessel originally used as a water canteen for travelers in the Middle East. They were easy to apply decoration to, per Alan Chong, the Annenberger learner. Here's an example of a blown glass 15th century pilgrim flask out of Italy. As you can see, the decoration has been applied in the center as well as along the neck of the piece. It's a little bit more ornate or delicate looking, not ornate, sorry, a little bit more delicate looking than the flask that we're going to be going over today. Then the other piece was Faenza. Faenza is an area in Italy where Maiolica ceramics or pottery was made. Now, what exactly is Maiolica pottery? Well, that was white glazed pottery. Florence, the region Florence, actually led the production of this particular type of pottery. It was in the 15th to 16th century that they started to use blue with their creation. So you've got blue and white pottery out of Maiolica. Then the next term that she used was Iznik pottery. We actually went over what Iznik pottery was, I believe, in week 13 when we were going over in the lecture for week 13. And Iznik pottery was created in Nicaea, or I'm sorry, in Iznik, which was formerly called Nicaea. It's southeast of Istanbul. Um, they used bold blues and even added in some turquoise colors in there against whites. This is an example of a blue and white hexagonal Iznik tile from the Ottoman Empire around 1530. It's exactly 10.5 inches in diameter, so it's a sizable piece. But you can see that blue, the cobalt blue against the white really stands out. What was the main message in this article? It was, this is a Medici piece. She went into the provenance of the flask. She showed how it was absolutely 100% Medici, but how it could also be easily confused by an untrained eye. And the influencers of the motif, because this was not a traditional Italian design. Instead, the artisans who created it pulled their influences from other regions. And she explained just how they did that. So I've mentioned the history of the Medici Pilgrim flask a couple times. So what is that history? Well, in April of 1857, Alessandro Foresi visited the studio of William Blundell Spence, where Foresi bought this flask. They both documented the exchange, and Foresi wrote in a note stating that he thought it was a Medici piece, but he wasn't sure because Spence, who bought it from a person who thought it was Chinese, thought that due to this mark on the bottom, this F, meant that it was a Faenza piece. Well, we know who was right, don't we? And we'll get into more of how they figured out that it was Medici instead of a Faenza piece shortly. Now, there are 3 other Medici Pilgrim flasks that contain similar homages to Chinese porcelain. This one in particular, one thing that sets this particular flask apart is it has silver threads inside of it to hold the cover or the lid. And they were actually able to trace that the artisans who provided silver to the Medicis. The silversmiths fully noted that that they had gone through and provided the silver for that creation. That's Bernardo Buontalenti in the note is noted in the lives of in Vasari's Lives of the Artists as actually providing silver to the Medici court at the time. And then there was also proof that Matteo Castrucci was paid by the Medicis for supplying silver for 5 porcelain flasks. Now, the Medicis had hundreds of porcelains in their collection. And one thing that Le Corbusier points out is, to the untrained eye, some of these pieces would be assumed to be Chinese as opposed to either Italian made or something from the Ottoman Empire. However, she did point out, and I'd like to show this to you over here. If you look at the head, you can see slight bubbling in the glaze. While the Italians were good at, or the Medicis were good at figuring out how to copy some of these techniques, they couldn't quite get down the precise way to apply glazes without getting bubbling. And that's one way that you could tell that it was a Medici. So, what influenced this? We know that it was definitely influenced by Chinese white and cobalt blue porcelain wares, but it also has a Turkish influence. And that Turkish influence came from the trades. There was a lot of trades between Italy and the Ottoman Empire. And one way that you can tell that this is influenced by them is the simulated stenciling of flowers. So if you look at this Iznik bowl here, you can see the floral stenciling that takes the simulated floral stenciling that's happening here. And then if you look down on the Medici flask, you can see that same stenciling effect, especially right here in the lower right. And that looks similar to these smaller flowers right in here. Then there was the stenciling technique became popular in Bursa around the 15th century, which was 100 years before the Medici flask was made. But without a doubt, that influence traveled to Italy. There's also a Chinese influence in this piece, which I'll get into on the next slide. But I want you to take note real quick of the free-flowing calligraphic motif along the sides. That's something that she points out is definitely a Chinese influence. So here, I'm sure that you recognize this piece. We just went over this one as well. It's the jar with lion head handles from the Yuan dynasty. So you can see the influence here of the Chinese artisans in the floral motif. They have that naturalistic leafy and flowering stems, and I apologize, I misspoke. It's the naturalistic floral stems that's the Chinese influence, but it's the free movement of those elements that comes from the Ottoman Empire. I apologize, I misspoke. Now, there were other Medici pieces that also gave away the fact that, or lent themselves to helping to track the provenance of this piece. There's a ewer, a jug, and a small ewer, which is this one here that's a part of the National Gallery in Washington, D.C.'s collection. And then you can see that they have similar floral motifs going on with them. And then the real giveaway of these Medici pieces is the stamp on the bottom. You can see here the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore. This dome is used on many Medici porcelain factory pieces. And that F, which they thought was Faenza or Faenza, actually is one of the Medici stamps on their flasks or on their pieces. What did I think of this article? Well, I really enjoyed it. I thought that she provided very convincing arguments for the provenance of the piece. I mean, she used notes from somebody who bought the flask in the 1800s. She went back and found ledgers of sales for silver, which went through and helped to verify where the silver for the threading for the cover of, which would be right up here, you can't really see it, what the cover would go into. So they were able to confirm that, in fact, there were silversmiths working with the Medici ceramic studios to combine both porcelain and ceramics with silver and gold. It was very well researched. One thing that I really appreciated in this particular article was all of the footnotes. She has, I don't want to say an overwhelming amount of footnotes, but she has a lot of footnotes, which shows that she really did her work. I loved her descriptions of pieces. She went through and she thoroughly described decoration on the flasks, and I really liked how she described the bubbling here that you see. She had said that they resulted in the lustrous depth of color in the darkest passages. And then she goes on to say that Medici porcelains collected in deep bubbled pools in the crevices of the masks, where the blue is lighter and quite irregular. She really describes what's wrong with the Medici piece. And I don't want to say wrong, but their flaws in the creation. Overall, I really enjoyed this article. I liked seeing the influence of East Asian ceramics in Italy. I've taken several European art history classes, and we haven't really gone into the ceramics. So this time I really enjoyed being able to see, like, tie my appreciation of European art to what I've been learning in the East Asian art class. And here's my bibliography. Thank you. It's long, just under 15 minutes now, but thank you so much for tuning in.